"Stay in the kitchen tonight," my husband whispered, adjusting his cufflinks as if I were something that needed to be hidden, not introduced. "Some of the guests are important." I nodded, the way I had learned to do after 42 years of marriage, quietly, without asking questions that would only be dismissed later, and I stepped back into the narrow space behind the swinging door while the sound of laughter and crystal glasses drifted in from the ballroom like a life I was no longer part of, because 10 minutes later, a man I had never met walked into that kitchen, looked directly at me as if he had known me for decades, and said, "I've been searching for you." The house was glowing that evening, every chandelier lit, every surface polished until it reflected the kind of perfection my husband had spent years building, the kind that didn't leave room for someone like me anymore. Someone who wore a simple navy dress instead of designer labels. Someone who still believed a marriage meant standing beside each other, not being carefully positioned out of sight. And as I stood near the counter pretending to rearrange a tray of untouched appetizers, I could hear Edward's voice out there, smooth and confident, introducing himself, introducing our son Daniel, even mentioning Claire with pride, but never once mentioning me, not even as an afterthought, as if I had quietly disappeared from the story we had once written together, and I told myself it was just for tonight, just for appearances, just until the important people had gone home. But the truth settled slowly, like a weight in my chest, that this wasn't new. It was simply clearer now, sharper, impossible to ignore, because it had been building for years in small, almost invisible ways, in the invitations that never included my name, in the conversations that paused when I entered the room, in the polite smiles that replaced genuine warmth. And I remembered standing in front of my bedroom mirror earlier that evening, smoothing the fabric of my dress, telling myself this would be different, that tonight Edward would take my hand and say, "This is my wife, Margaret," the way he used to, back when I was part of the picture he was so proud to show the world. But instead, I found myself counting the minutes between footsteps, listening to strangers celebrate a life I had helped build but was no longer allowed to claim. And I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't even feel angry in that moment. Just something colder, quieter, like the slow realization that I had been erased long before tonight, and I simply hadn't noticed until now. Until the kitchen door swung open and a man in a tailored suit stepped inside, pausing as if the entire evening had led him to this exact moment, his eyes scanning the room once before settling on me with a certainty that made my breath catch, not because of who he was, but because of the way he looked at me, not with dismissal or polite indifference, but with recognition, as if I were the missing piece of something much larger, something that had been waiting patiently to be found. He did not speak again right away, and somehow that silence felt heavier than any introduction could have been, because while the music and conversation continued just a few feet away, the air in that kitchen seemed to still completely as he took a slow step closer, studying my face with a quiet intensity that made me feel seen in a way I had not felt in years, and I found myself instinctively straightening my posture, as if some part of me remembered who I used to be before I learned how to make myself smaller, less noticeable, easier to overlook. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was calm, certain, and entirely out of place in a room meant for catering staff and forgotten trays. "Margaret Whitmore, right?" he said, not asking but confirming. And for a moment I could not respond, not because I did not recognize my own name, but because I could not remember the last time someone had said it with that kind of certainty, without hesitation or dismissal, just recognition, as if it carried weight, as if it meant something beyond being someone's wife or someone's mother. And I felt a flicker of something I had not allowed myself to feel in a long time, something dangerously close to pride, quickly followed by confusion, because nothing about this evening suggested that anyone important would be looking for me, especially not a man dressed like he belonged at the center of the room I had been quietly excluded from. And yet there he was, standing in front of me as if I were the reason he had walked through that door at all, and I managed to nod slowly, my voice steady even though my thoughts were not. "Yes," I said, keeping it simple the way I always did when I was unsure of the ground beneath me. And he exhaled a small breath, almost like relief, as if he had just confirmed something that mattered far more than I understood. "Good," he replied softly, glancing once toward the door before lowering his voice. "I was not sure if I would find you here, but I was told this is where you might be. And there was something in the way he said it that made my stomach tighten, not with fear, but with the strange realization that my presence in this kitchen had not gone unnoticed after all, that someone had known exactly where I had been placed, as if it were not accidental but intentional. And for the first time that night, I felt the full weight of what Edward had done settle into something solid and undeniable, not just a small embarrassment to smooth over later, but a decision, a choice to put me out of sight in a room where I did not belong. And as that realization took shape, the man in front of me extended his hand, a simple gesture, but one that carried a level of respect I had not been offered all evening. "Jonathan Reeves," he said, his tone formal but not distant, and the name landed in my mind a second before I fully connected it to the conversations I had overheard earlier, the quiet excitement, the careful preparation, the reason tonight mattered so much to Edward and Daniel. And I felt something shift again, this time not inside me, but around me, as if the balance of the evening had tilted in a way no one else in that ballroom had yet realized. And when I took his hand, I noticed the way he did not rush the moment, did not treat it as an obligation, but as something intentional, something important, and I found myself asking the question that had been building quietly since he first walked in, my voice still calm, still measured, but no longer uncertain. "Why have you been searching for me?" And for the first time since he entered the room, Jonathan Reeves smiled, not politely, not out of courtesy, but with the kind of recognition that suggested he already knew the answer would change everything. He did not answer immediately, and that pause felt deliberate, as if he wanted me to sit with the question just long enough to understand that whatever came next was not casual or insignificant. And when he finally spoke, his voice lowered even further, carrying a tone that was both respectful and certain. "Because this company cannot move forward without you," he said, and for a moment I thought I had misheard him. Not because the words were unclear, but because they did not fit into the version of my life I had been living for years, the one where I stood quietly in kitchens while decisions were made in rooms I was no longer invited into, and I felt my brows draw together slightly, a reflex I could not control, as I searched his face for any sign that this was some kind of misunderstanding, but there was none. Only calm confidence, the kind that comes from knowing something the other person has yet to realize. And he continued before I could respond, "I have been reviewing the original documents for months now, trying to understand how everything was structured in the early years, and your name kept appearing in places it should not have if you were only what they said you were." And something in my chest tightened at that, not painfully, but sharply, like a memory being pulled back into focus after years of being deliberately blurred. And I glanced instinctively toward the door, where the voices of my husband and son carried on, unaware of what was unfolding just steps away, unaware that the version of the story they had been presenting all evening was beginning to unravel in the quietest possible way. And I turned back to him slowly, my voice steady but softer now. "I think you may have the wrong person," I said, because it was easier to question him than to question the years I had spent convincing myself that stepping back had been the right choice, that letting Edward take the lead had been an act of support rather than surrender. But Jonathan shook his head almost immediately, not dismissively, but firmly. "No," he said, "I do not." And he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, pulling out a thin folder that looked far too deliberate to be a coincidence. And when he opened it, I caught a glimpse of familiar pages, old paper, signatures I had not seen in decades, and my breath caught, slightly despite myself, because I recognized the handwriting before I even fully processed what I was seeing, my own, younger, steadier, written at a time when everything we were building had felt like it belonged to both of us equally. Before titles had shifted and introductions had changed, and I had quietly allowed myself to fade into the background. And he held the folder carefully, not handing it to me yet, but making sure I could see enough to understand. "You were not just there at the beginning," he said, his tone unwavering. "You were the beginning." And the words settled into the space between us with a weight that felt both familiar and foreign at the same time. Because part of me had always known it, buried it, set it aside for the sake of peace, for the sake of family, for the sake of a man I believed would always stand beside me, not place me behind a kitchen door. And I felt something shift inside me again. Not confusion this time, not even hurt, but clarity, quiet and steady, like a door opening where there had only ever been walls. And for the first time that night, I did not look toward the ballroom or listen for Edward's voice, because for the first time, it no longer felt like the center of anything that mattered. For a few seconds, I did not reach for the folder, even though every instinct told me to take it, to confirm what I already knew was true, because accepting it meant facing something far more difficult than being ignored at a party. It meant admitting that I had allowed myself to disappear from a life I had once helped create, and my eyes lingered on the edge of those papers as memories began to surface, not all at once, but slowly, carefully. Like pieces of a story I had packed away and labeled as something that no longer mattered. I saw a younger version of myself sitting at a small wooden desk in a cramped office with peeling paint and a flickering light, sketching out numbers, building projections, making decisions that would shape something neither of us fully understood at the time, and Edward sitting across from me, watching, listening, asking for my opinion before making any move, because back then we were partners in every sense of the word. Not just in name, but in action, in respect, in shared ambition. And I remembered the nights we stayed up past midnight, working through problems that seemed impossible, celebrating small wins as if they were milestones, promising each other that if success ever came, it would belong to both of us equally. And I let out a quiet breath as I finally reached forward and took the folder from Jonathan's hand, the paper cool against my fingers, grounding me in a reality I had not allowed myself to revisit in years. And as I opened it fully this time, the signatures were unmistakable, mine beside Edward's, page after page, evidence of a partnership that had never truly been erased, only redefined in a way that benefited everyone but me. And I felt something shift again, not with anger, not with regret, but with a kind of clarity that was almost unsettling in its calmness, because I could see now how it had happened, not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of quiet choices, mine included, stepping back when Daniel was born, taking fewer meetings, allowing Edward to represent us more often, trusting that our shared foundation would remain unchanged, and then slowly, almost invisibly, that foundation had been rewritten, my role reduced, my presence minimized, until nights like this one felt normal, expected even, as if I had always belonged behind a door instead of beside him. And I closed the folder gently, my fingers steady despite the weight of what it contained. And when I looked back up at Jonathan, there was no confusion left in my expression, only understanding. And for the first time since I walked into that house, I felt something I had not realized was missing, not pride exactly, but recognition of my own place in a story I had allowed others to retell without me. And I spoke quietly, not to challenge him, but to confirm what I now understood. They moved forward without me, I said, and he shook his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. They tried to, he corrected, and the difference between those two sentences settled into the space between us with quiet precision, because one suggested I had been left behind, while the other made it clear that I had never truly been removed at all. And somewhere beyond the kitchen door, I could hear Edward's voice again, confident, controlled, certain that everything was proceeding exactly as planned, unaware that the version of the past he had been presenting was beginning to come undone in the most unexpected place, not in the spotlight he had so carefully prepared, but in the small, overlooked room where he believed I no longer mattered. Jonathan did not rush me, and that alone told me more than anything he could have said out loud, because in a room where everything had been carefully timed and controlled, his patience felt deliberate, almost respectful of something I was only just beginning to reclaim. And after a moment, he glanced once more toward the door before speaking again, his voice steady, precise, as if he had already considered every possible outcome of this conversation. "There is a signing tonight," he said, and I felt my attention sharpen instantly, not because the words themselves were surprising, but because of the way he said them, as if the event happening just a few feet away was not what it seemed. Edward has been presenting himself as the sole founder for years, positioning the company for a major acquisition, and on paper, it looks clean, straightforward, profitable. He continued, his tone never rising, never dramatic, but carrying a weight that made every word land with quiet impact. But when we reviewed the original structure, the early agreements, the formation documents, it became clear that there is a signature missing from the current narrative, and he paused just long enough for that sentence to settle before meeting my eyes again. Yours, he added simply, and something in me went completely still at that, not out of shock, but out of recognition, because I understood exactly what that meant without needing further explanation. The deal that Edward had been preparing, the one that required tonight's performance, tonight's carefully curated image, was incomplete without me, not emotionally, not symbolically, but legally, structurally, undeniably. And I let out a slow breath, my fingers still resting lightly against the edge of the folder as I processed the implications, because for years I had believed that stepping back had made things easier for everyone, that my absence had smoothed the path forward. But now I could see that what had been presented as simplicity was actually omission, a quiet rewriting of the foundation we had built together. And I spoke without looking away, my voice calm, almost detached. He never intended to include me, I said, not as a question but as a realization, and Jonathan gave a small, measured nod. He structured everything to move forward without you being present, he replied, choosing his words carefully. But he could not remove what was already established, only hoped that it would never be questioned. And I felt the faintest shift in my expression then, not anger, not hurt, but something closer to understanding the full scope of what had been done. Because this was not just about being left out of a party or hidden in a kitchen, it was about being deliberately excluded from a future that had been built on my past. And as that clarity settled in, the sounds from the ballroom grew louder, applause rising briefly before fading again, as if something important was unfolding right on schedule, exactly as Edward had planned, and I realized with a quiet certainty that whatever was about to happen out there had been designed without any expectation that I would step into it. And for the first time in a long while, I considered what it would mean not to follow that script, not to remain where I had been placed, but to choose something different entirely. And Jonathan seemed to sense that shift before I spoke, his posture straightening slightly, not in urgency, but in readiness. If you do nothing, he said carefully, the deal will proceed, and your absence will be treated as consent. And he let that sentence rest between us before adding, but if you walk out there with me, everything changes. And I did not respond immediately, not because I did not understand, but because I wanted to feel the weight of that choice fully, to recognize that this moment, quiet and almost hidden, was the point where everything could turn. And for the first time that night, I did not feel like someone waiting to be acknowledged. I felt like someone being given a decision, and that realization was far more powerful than anything that had happened in the ballroom beyond that door. For a long moment, I said nothing, and it was not hesitation, not fear, but something far quieter, the careful weighing of a life I had lived against a life that had been quietly taken from me. Because I understood now that this was not simply about correcting a misunderstanding or stepping into a room where I had been excluded. It was about deciding whether I would continue to accept the version of myself that had been reduced, softened, made invisible for the comfort of others, or whether I would finally stand in the place that had always been mine. And I could still hear Edward's voice through the door, steady and confident, the same voice that once asked for my input, that once waited for my approval before moving forward, now speaking as if everything had always belonged to him alone. And I felt a faint, almost distant memory of the woman I used to be, the one who would have stepped back to keep the peace, who would have convinced herself that it was easier this way, that it did not matter who received the recognition as long as the family stayed intact. But that version of me felt unfamiliar now, like a story I no longer believed in. And I looked down at the folder once more, at the signatures that had not faded, at the proof that I had not imagined my place in any of this. And I closed it gently, my hands steady, my breath even, and when I lifted my gaze back to Jonathan, there was no uncertainty left in it, only a quiet decision that had already been made before I spoke. If I walk out there, I said, my voice calm, measured, I am not stepping back again. And he nodded once, not surprised, not relieved, simply acknowledging what he had likely expected all along. And he stepped slightly aside, not leading me, not guiding me, but allowing me the space to move forward on my own terms. And that small gesture mattered more than anything else in that moment, because it was the first time that night that no one had tried to position me, hide me, or define where I belonged. And as I reached for the door, my hand resting briefly against the cool surface, I noticed something I had not felt when I first entered the kitchen. There was no heaviness in my chest, no quiet ache of being overlooked, only a steady clarity that made everything around me feel sharper, more defined, as if the entire evening had shifted from something happening to me into something I was about to step into. And when I pushed the door open, the sound from the ballroom filled the space instantly. Laughter, conversation, the soft clink of glasses, all continuing exactly as before, unaware that anything had changed. And for a brief second, I saw it all the way I had earlier, as something distant, something I was not part of. But then I took a step forward, and then another, and the distance closed, not dramatically, not suddenly, but with a quiet certainty that did not need to announce itself. And I saw Edward near the center of the room, surrounded by people who were listening to him, nodding, smiling, believing every word he said. And I noticed the way Daniel stood beside him, mirroring his posture, his confidence, as if this had always been his place as well, and Claire nearby, watching everything carefully, ensuring that the image remained intact. And for a moment, no one noticed me, which felt almost fitting, almost expected, until one of the guests turned slightly, their gaze shifting past Edward, past the carefully constructed scene, and landed on me. And then another, and another, the subtle ripple of attention moving through the room, not because I demanded it, but because I did not step back when it found me. And I continued forward, not toward the edges, not toward the places where I had been quietly guided before, but toward the center, toward the place where my absence had been assumed. And as I approached, Edward's voice faltered just slightly, barely noticeable to anyone else, but unmistakable to me. And when his eyes finally met mine, I saw something I had not seen in a very long time. Not irritation, not dismissal, but uncertainty. And I realized in that moment that for the first time in years, I was no longer where he expected me to be. The room did not fall silent all at once, but it shifted, subtly at first, like a current changing direction beneath calm water, because people noticed before they reacted, their conversations slowing, their attention drifting, drawn not by anything I said, but by the simple fact that I did not stop walking. And Edward saw it too. I could tell by the way his posture adjusted, the way his smile held just a fraction too long before fading into something tighter, more controlled. And when I reached the edge of the circle he had built around himself, he cleared his throat lightly, attempting to recover the rhythm of the moment. "Margaret," he said, his tone carefully neutral, as if my presence required explanation but not acknowledgement, as if I were an interruption rather than part of the story he had been telling. And for a brief second, I saw the expectation in his eyes, the assumption that I would nod politely, retreat, allow him to continue, the same pattern that had played out countless times before. But I did not move, I did not step back, and that alone seemed to unsettle him more than any words could have. And before he could continue, Jonathan stepped forward beside me, not in front, not taking over, but placing himself in the conversation in a way that shifted its balance instantly. And the room responded to him in a way it never had to me before, attention sharpening, voices quieting, because his presence carried authority that no one questioned. And Edward's expression changed again, recognition replacing control. "Jonathan," he said, forcing a smile that did not quite reach his eyes, "I did not realize you had arrived." And Jonathan nodded slightly, his gaze steady, composed. "I have," he replied, his tone calm but unmistakably direct. "And I believe there is someone here you have not properly introduced." And the words landed with precision, not loud, not confrontational, but impossible to ignore. And I felt the subtle ripple move through the people around us, curiosity rising, attention narrowing, as the carefully managed image began to crack in small, almost invisible ways. And Edward let out a short breath, the kind that comes before a controlled response. "Of course," he said, turning slightly toward me, his hand lifting in a gesture that felt rehearsed even in that moment. "This is my wife, Margaret." And the introduction was simple, minimal, exactly as it had been reduced over the years. But Jonathan did not nod, did not accept it as complete. Instead, he held the moment just long enough to make the absence of something else noticeable. "Your wife," he repeated, his voice even, thoughtful. "And also," he added, his eyes never leaving Edward's, "the co-founder of this company." And for the first time that evening, There was no subtlety in the shift that followed. The room did not just quiet. It stilled completely, conversation stopping mid-sentence, expressions changing as people processed what had just been said, because it was not just a correction, it was a revelation, one that did not fit into the narrative they had been given. And I watched Edward closely, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a calm clarity that allowed me to see exactly what he was thinking, how quickly he was trying to adjust, to regain control, to reshape the moment before it moved beyond him. But there was something different now, something he could not easily manage, because this was no longer about what he said or how he presented things. It was about what had already been established, what had been written, signed, documented, and could not simply be spoken away, and I did not speak. Not yet, because I did not need to. The truth was already in the room, carried not by my voice, but by someone whose authority they all recognized. And as the silence stretched, I realized that for the first time in years, I was not waiting to be acknowledged. I was being seen, fully, clearly, without permission, and that changed everything. Edward did not respond immediately, and that hesitation, brief as it was, said more than any denial could have, because the room was no longer looking at him the way it had been just moments before. They were not waiting to be impressed, they were waiting to understand, and that shift, quiet but undeniable, moved through the space like a ripple that could not be contained, and I saw Daniel glance toward his father, searching for direction, for a cue on how to react, while Claire's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, her composure still intact but no longer effortless, and Edward finally let out a controlled breath, his smile returning, but thinner now, carefully measured. There seems to be some confusion, he began, his voice smooth but lacking the ease it carried earlier, and I could hear the intention behind it, to reduce, to redirect, to turn something significant into something minor, manageable. But Jonathan did not interrupt, did not challenge him directly. He simply allowed the moment to extend just enough for the weight of what had already been said to settle deeper into the room. And then, without raising his voice, without shifting his tone, he spoke again. "There is no confusion," he said, and the certainty in those 4 words carried more authority than any explanation Edward could attempt. And I felt the attention shift once more, not toward conflict, but toward clarity, as if the room itself had decided which version of the story it was willing to believe. And I remained where I was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, simply present in a way that did not require effort anymore. And for the first time, I noticed how many people were looking directly at me, not past me, not through me, but at me, with curiosity, with recognition, with questions they had not known to ask before. And Jonathan continued, his words measured, deliberate. "The original formation documents list Margaret Whitmore as a founding partner with equal standing in the structure that supports this company today." And as he spoke, I could see the realization begin to take shape in the expressions around us, the quiet recalculations, the reassessment of everything they had assumed when they walked into this room. And Edward's posture shifted again, more rigid now, less fluid, as if he were holding himself in place rather than moving naturally within the space he had controlled so easily before. "Those documents were from a long time ago," he said, attempting to regain ground, to place distance between the past and the present. But even as he said it, I could hear the weakness in the argument, because time did not erase what had been established, it only obscured it. And I felt something settle fully within me then, not a surge of emotion, not a dramatic realization, but a quiet alignment of truth and presence that made everything feel unexpectedly simple. And without raising my voice, without forcing attention, I spoke, not to challenge him, not to confront him, but to complete what had already begun. "They were never replaced," I said, and the room did not react with surprise, not outwardly, but I could feel the shift deepen, the understanding solidify, because the conversation was no longer about perception, it was about fact, and facts did not bend easily. And Edward looked at me then, really looked at me, not as someone to manage or dismiss, but as someone he had underestimated, and I held his gaze calmly, not with anger, not with accusation, but with the quiet certainty of someone who no longer needed permission to exist in the space she had always belonged in. And in that moment, I realized that nothing I could have said earlier would have carried the same weight as this, not because I had changed, but because I had finally stopped stepping aside long enough for the truth to be seen. No one spoke for a moment after that, not because they did not have anything to say, but because they understood that whatever came next would define more than just a business deal. It would define who truly held the foundation of everything standing in that room. And I could see it clearly now in the way people shifted their weight, in the way their eyes moved between Edward and me, measuring, reassessing, recalculating everything they thought they knew. And Jonathan did not rush the silence. He allowed it to stretch just long enough for the truth to settle into every corner of the room before he spoke again, his tone calm, almost conversational. "We were prepared to finalize the acquisition tonight," he said, and I saw Edward's shoulders tighten ever so slightly, the first real sign that control was slipping beyond recovery. "But that cannot happen without the acknowledgement and authorization of all founding partners," he continued. And the words were not dramatic. They did not need to be, because their impact was already clear to everyone listening. And I felt Daniel's attention shift sharply toward me, confusion replacing certainty, while Claire's composure remained intact, but her focus sharpened, calculating outcomes, adjusting expectations in real time. And Edward finally stepped forward, closing the space between us by a small but deliberate distance, his voice lower now, controlled but edged with something that had not been there before. "Margaret, we can discuss this privately," he said. And for a brief moment, the old instinct surfaced, the familiar pattern of stepping aside, of resolving things quietly, away from eyes that did not need to see. But it faded just as quickly as it appeared, because I understood now that privacy had never been about protection. It had been about control. And I met his gaze without hesitation, my voice even, steady. "There is nothing private about something that was built in plain sight," I replied, and the simplicity of that sentence seemed to carry further than anything louder or sharper could have, because it did not accuse, it did not argue, it simply stated what was already true. And I saw the realization settle into his expression, not fully, not completely, but enough to understand that the path he had been following no longer led where he expected. And Jonathan stepped slightly forward again, not taking over, but reinforcing what had already been established. "We can proceed," he said, glancing briefly toward me before returning his attention to Edward. "When all parties are present and recognized," and the emphasis was subtle but unmistakable. And for the first time that evening, I did not feel like I was standing in someone else's space. I felt like I was standing exactly where I had always belonged, without needing to claim it, without needing to prove it, simply by not stepping away from it anymore. And I let the silence return once more, not as something uncomfortable, but as something final, something that marked the end of one version of this story and the beginning of another. And I turned my gaze briefly across the room, taking in the faces, the shifting expressions, the quiet understanding that nothing would continue the way it had been planned. And when I looked back at Edward, I did not see the man who had hidden me earlier that evening. I saw someone who had underestimated what it meant to remove me from a place that had never stopped being mine. And I spoke one last time, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a clarity that did not leave room for reinterpretation. "You tried to move forward without me," I said, holding his gaze steadily. "But you built everything on something you could not leave behind." And I did not wait for a response, because I no longer needed one. And as I stepped slightly to the side, not retreating but repositioning myself within the space, I understood something with complete certainty. I had not been found that night. I had simply stopped allowing myself to be hidden.